that is ministry, I guess, in this age where you have YouTube channels and you can place things out for folks to be able to find them. Hopefully you are where you want to be. We're in accessibility session number 2, and we're really grateful to have Jim Lefevre with us. Jim is an architect by background. He's a former district moderator. And I've worked most closely with him over the past year and a half as he is doing the design work for the remodeling and the creation of the new facility in Los Banos for Centro Agape Nacion congregation. And we're hopeful that in another month, the city will have approved the plans and we can start that work. But the kinds of things he's talking about, I got to watch firsthand as he was doing some of this. So I want to welcome Jim, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Before you start, can I report? I called. Peggy is home.
Good.
She's a Kaiser patient, and they sent him home. So
Very
she's
good.
resting. She's very tired, but she got along fine, and she has someone with her for the night and the next day, I think. So we'll just send her our greetings and prayers and go on with the show.
Very good. That was Peggy Redmond. If you came in, she had a knee replacement done today, but she's back at her apartment. So, Jim.
Okay. See if this works here. There we go. Can you see my screen?
We're not seeing your screen right now.
Hey, what am I doing here?
I can see you.
You can see me, but that's not what we want you to see.
Well, I can see you. That's all. I can see you and I can see me, and that's all I can see.
Yeah.
Let's
Okay.
see
Let me.
here.
Right. Oh, okay. Share. Okay. This might do it.
Nice.
And you lost the snow, I hope. Okay, so since Russ introduced me, I'll sort of zip through this a little bit. In my experience, churches are a little bit rare for me to work on. Most of my experience has to do with hotels and government buildings and a few class buildings, but a lot of the issues related to accessibility are there too. My profession has been architecture primarily on the technical side, not the design side, so that my work is typically with building owners and building departments and the contractors. So it's in the actual sort of implementation of projects rather than sort of the conceptualization. I am, because I'm a licensed architect, required to take 5 hours of accessibility training every time I renew my license, and that's every second year. So I've now probably had 25, 30 hours worth of accessibility training, which is doing pretty much exactly what I'm doing tonight. That is, I'm sitting on my computer, listening to somebody talk about how to deal with issues of accessibility. And I just put this on. I'm not looking for work. I'm retired. I will give you my email at the end of the session, and I'm perfectly happy to field questions from time to time, do a little pro bono work once in a while, but basically my working for pay is pretty much behind me. So session goals, what we're going to do is, what I'm doing, because it's where my experience is most heavy, is I'm looking at how the various codes and rules, sets of rules apply to making an accessible space. So the two sets that we'll talk about are ADA and the local building codes. And we'll just use, they've got a lot of tools in those codes, or a lot of standards in those codes, which if properly applied, mitigate a lot of accessibility issues. So this presentation, if you were in the presentation yesterday, last night, the focus was sort of on getting from the sidewalk into the sanctuary of a church. Tonight, it's going to take a little bit more of a experiential look at it of what it's like to be in a sanctuary and how you make it more comfortable for somebody who may have some disabilities or some problems. And it's a big topic. I'm going to cover as much as I can in an hour, but there are lots of things that I won't be able to get to. So the rules of the road that we're using are the Americans for Disabilities Act, based on 2010 standards, and they are available online. If you get a copy of this document from me, you can get that link. They're available, they're free, they're pretty easy to use. In Nevada and Arizona, what we have probably is the International Building Code, and specifically in the International Building Code, Chapter 11. The reason I say probably for Nevada and Arizona, I should say, is that those are two of, I think, 3 states in the country that don't have a state building code. They allow each municipality to pick their own code. So you have to call your local building department and say, what code is it that I'm using? If it is in fact the International Building Code, it too has an online free site. And if you're in California, there's the California Building Code, which is a variation on the International Building Code. But when it comes to accessibility, what you're going to find out is California has taken the chapter on accessibility that's in the International Code and thrown it out and put in the California Code. The good news is that every time California reissues the code, which is every 3 years, it gets closer and closer to ADA. So we're gradually converging. So what is the ADA? The ADA is part of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. And the focus of the act was not about how to do architecture, but how to not discriminate against people who have special needs. So it's really was part of a broader civil rights legislation. As based on that legislation, the US Justice Department has developed and published standards. And in addition to publishing standards, they actually have an 800 number, which can be pretty helpful to talk to if you have a question. And those are all free services. By law, all covered businesses and organizations have to be made accessible. And this is going back from 1968. So at least in theory, if it was working the way it's supposed to, you wouldn't have any problems in any businesses now. But the fact of the matter is that you can go many places where there are accessibility issues today. One of the reasons for that is there is no enforcement agency for ADA. ADA is enforced by lawsuit. It's enforced by the injured parties or people who think they're an injured party. What the law does in the Justice Department standards is it establishes criteria and it makes it clearer how the lawsuit is going to play out. If there is one, either you match the criteria or you don't. When a violation is documented, the building owner or the tenant in the building needs to correct the problem, and there may be a cash settlement or penalty. And then the hooker in here, churches are exempt from ADA. So all the standards are out there. As far as the federal government is concerned, a church doesn't have to comply with it. Trick here is that if the church has tenants that are not part of your religious services, they may in fact be subject to the ADA. So for example, if you have a daycare that's not part of your ministry, or if you have after-school training or something like that that's not part of your ministry, or you accept some community organization and allow them to use your building, those organizations can be sued for the defects in the church building. And how that works out, I don't know, but it is an issue. I did actually use the 800 number at the Justice Department and ask them that question. And the consultant on the other end sort of looked in his computer and did find a situation where a church had offered their facilities to a local community theater, and that theater had in fact been successfully sued for failing to comply with ADA. So it's an issue. I do put ADA in here because I think that they are a very clearly, reasonably readable document, clearly thought out, reasonable document. And if you're looking at how to accommodate people in your building, it's a good starting place. It's probably significantly easier to read the ADA standards than it is your standard building code. Okay, building codes, some of you may know, anytime you do work on a building where a permit is required, it has to comply with building code. And that can be a new building or it can be a work of renovation. By code, all new work has to be fully accessible. There's no excuse for inaccessibility in a new building. By code, when you're renovating an existing building, the renovated area needs to be fully accessible. So for example, if we're renovating the pastor's office, everything in that office needs to meet code, and that would be the size of the door, the access to the door, the type of door hardware, location of switches, location of outlets, and just maneuvering room in the office, for example. The next thing is that you have to get from the building entry, the entry of the church, to the renovated area, that hypothetical office. You have to have a path that's accessible. So for example, if you had a couple of steps between the pastor's office and the street, you'd probably have to figure out how to make those accessible. In fact, almost certainly would have to figure out how to get past those steps in one way or another. The one that gets to be really expensive is you have to have an accessible restroom. If you don't have it, and many of our old churches do not have accessible restrooms, that can be a challenge. Definitely, if you get into that situation, you want to have somebody who knows the rules to get through that process. And churches are not exempt from building codes. So there are fire codes, building codes apply to churches just as they do to any other building. So who are we thinking about? The common thought and the most energy with accessibility goes into people who have what we refer to as mobility impairment, people in a wheelchair. And probably the most expense in accommodating accessibility issues is really trying to work around wheelchairs. Individuals using walkers, crutches, or people just who have difficulty walking are accommodated by ADA. And for practical purposes, it also really covers people carrying awkward burdens, carrying a child, carrying the groceries, moving furniture. All of the ADA properly implemented helps all these categories of people. It also includes vision impairment, whether blind or with the limited vision. And we'll talk a little bit about that today, probably a little bit more than I did yesterday. It also covers the hearing impaired. And that could be somebody who is profoundly deaf, or it could be somebody who just needs some help. And ADA also has been used successfully from time to time to deal with people with mental impairments. I won't talk about that much today, but I think in terms of thinking about a church, you might think about how the environment is either threatening or comforting to a person who has an impairment, how you could make a person feel comfortable and safe within your facility, and what kind of support would be necessary. The building code doesn't get into that, and as I say, ADA doesn't apply to churches, so it's not mandatory, but it certainly would be the Christian response. So here, for the purposes of my discussion tonight, I've created a little hypothetical church, and it's got sort of the elements of many churches. It's got a sanctuary. It's got a lot of pews screwed to the floor, presumably. It's got a front of the church with an altar table, pulpit, a musical device of some sort, and a choir area. Some of our churches are small and don't have so much stuff in them. Some of our churches have flexible seating, and that makes a difference too. But this is the stuff that you would have to work around making a church accessible. And we'll talk about some of the problems and possible solutions. So the first thing that I want to talk about tonight is, as you come into the sanctuary, there needs to be somewhere to sit. And if you're in a wheelchair, I mean, that's going to be a challenge. But ADA actually looks at 3 different kinds of seating requirements, or specifies 3 different kinds of seating. They include seating for wheelchairs. It also specifies that we will provide companion seating. That is, the assumption is that the person in the wheelchair came with somebody else and that they want to sit with that person. So we don't separate people mechanically by how we respond to wheelchairs. And thirdly, this was a little bit of a surprise to me when I started doing these talks, aisle seating. And what this is aiming at is people not necessarily in a wheelchair, maybe have difficulty walking, maybe using a cane or a walker, need to get to a seat that's comfortable. And what we're going to need to do is reserve seats for them so that if they come a little late, they don't have to somehow get to the middle of an aisle. They don't have to get past 3 or 4 other people that are already seated there. So we designate some aisle seating. Okay, so what are the ideas on wheelchair spacing? Generally speaking, in ADA, when we make a space for a wheelchair, we're looking at something that's 36 inches wide and 48 inches long. Most wheelchairs will fit within that envelope. Very few, if any, are actually that big. So when we provide a wheelchair space, the space they're going to ask us to provide is that 36 by 48 space. There's some variations on that. If you're in a situation where you have 2 wheelchairs side by side, they'll actually allow you to provide only 33 inches for each chair. If the space you're provided is hypothetically in the back row, so you can pull in from the back forward, or in a front row type situation where you can back into the space, your 36 by 48 space is sufficient. If, on the other hand, the entry to the space is from the side, this gets to be sort of a parallel parking situation, and the standards call for a 60-inch deep space. So that allows somebody to maneuver into that space. Okay, another standard is the wheelchair spaces don't overlap circulation paths. And basically that means you can't sit them in the hallway, you can't sit them in the aisle. They're not to be viewed as a problem by other people entering the building, and they're not supposed to be sort of harassed or be intimidated by traffic moving around them. They need to have a space that's their own. Okay, so in my little example church, my pews are 21 feet long, and by code that works out to 10 people per pew. I have 42 pews in the church, so I'm looking at 420 people or 420 seats, hypothetically. And that, there's a table in the building code, there's a table in ADA, it's pretty much the same table. My 420 gets me happily in the 301 to 500 seat category. And what that's telling me is I need within my facility to provide 6 wheelchair spaces. So looking back at my sanctuary here, I've carved out 6 wheelchair spaces. Now, what you'll notice is that that 60-inch requirement of side parking has me taking out the ends of 2 pews for each wheelchair space. I suppose if you wanted to put 2 wheelchairs, one in front of the other, you might get away with taking out only 3. And but so you're going to lose a little bit more seating than just 1 seat per person typically. Okay, then we get to the concept of companion seating. And in a row seating environment, which is certainly what you have with pews, or you might have with chairs lined up, the notion is that a companion really has to sit with the person in the wheelchair, and that means that they want them to be shoulder to shoulder. The companion shouldn't be significantly behind the person in the wheelchair, they shouldn't be significantly in front of the person in the wheelchair. They should be able to sort of reach over and chat with the person in the wheelchair. They actually, the codes like to do this. They define where the shoulder is. It's 36 inches back from the front of the wheelchair. So it's a pretty practical number. The floor surface of the companion seat shall be at the same elevation as the floor surface or the wheelchair space. So we don't want the companion to be significantly above or significantly below the person in the wheelchair. And this is going to be more of an issue in a movie theater or something like that where you have a sloped floor. And we don't want to treat companions as a second-class citizen. So their seat shall be equivalent in size, quality, comfort, and amenities to any other seat in the general area. So whatever somebody in the pew gets, the companion gets. If it's a solid oak pew without a cushion, that's fine for the companion too. If it's got a cushion, the companion should get that. And companion seats can be movable. So if it works out that that's the best way to handle it, you can make a double wide space with a movable seat in it. Again, this is sometimes seen more in theaters and things like in auditoriums than you probably see in a church. So here is the way a pew arrangement would work. The reserved companion seats are sort of highlighted in yellow here, so that the companion is in fact allowed to sit with each of the wheelchair spaces. And here is how it practically works. There's an individual who's basically sitting with the person in the wheelchair. It's the thrust of all of this is that a person needing some accommodation is treated as much like a person who doesn't need accommodation as is physically possible. So if you have a friend you come to church with, you need to be able to sit with your friend or wife or spouse or whatever. Now the idea of aisle seats. This is kind of a little bit twisty here, but 5% of the seats on an accessible aisle, that is an aisle you can walk up and down that's wide enough to be accessible, are to be designated as aisle seats. See, where a seat has armrests in the general area, there will be an armrest in the aisle seat, but it has to be, the one on the aisle side has to be folding or retractable so that the armrest doesn't impair the ability to get into the seat. And an aisle seat has to be designated. You have to mark it in such a way that it's kind of reserved for the person with that special need. In my example, I have 42 pews. Each pew's got 2 ends, so you have essentially 84 aisle seats. 5% of 84 is 4.2. And the way these codes tend to work is that you round up. So I provide 5 aisle seats. And here I've shown the aisle seats with little green patches, 5 of them in our little congregation. They could be along the side aisles. In this particular case, I've shown them all on the center aisle. It's not a big issue. And this is an individual sitting in an aisle seat. There is a sign on the back that reserves it for somebody with special needs. And in this case, as in a lot of our churches, the pews have an end on it that serves as an armrest in a way. I think to comply with this code, you would have to cut that piece of armrest away. And for my purposes, I've at least shown a retractable or a folding armrest to replace the permanent one. You could probably argue that armrests weren't typically provided in pews and you didn't need one. I think it's just a nice accommodation. So at this point, if anybody has any questions about seating or what we're up to thus far, I'll take them. And otherwise, we'll move on. Questions? Wyatt?
I just think it's an interesting one to think about marking the seats for the aisle access. I can remember in our congregation, we would make sure we had chairs that didn't have arms often on the end, so they were easy to get in and out of, but to put that in, and so, and I don't see pew makers making pews with that in, but, you know, they ought to be building so churches ordering those things could get access to.
It should be something that's showing up now as a requirement. It does show up in the codes. So again, it's some of these probably are much more commonly seen in public auditoriums and theaters than in churches. So it may be perking slowly through the system. Okay, now this is kind of the layout of the Glendale Church, but I have a suspicion it's a layout of a lot of churches. When you get to the front of the church, there's some steps there. And this morning I decided it would, before I talk to you, I'd best go review the building code on how to think about steps. And by definition, if I have 2 or more steps, and I have got 2 here, that's a staircase. That's a stairway. What do I need on a stairway? I need handrails. And so to be fully accommodated in this kind of a situation, you would need handrails. Now, the interesting thing here is because the width of the stair, you could rationalize putting them a number of places, but in this case, for reasons that'll later become more obvious, I've chosen to put them in the center. In the state of California, and only as far as I know in the state of California, you're required to mark the bottom riser or the bottom tread and the top landing with a contrasting stripe. That could be a carpet inset if this is carpeting. It could actually be paint on the carpet. It could be some sort of a metal strip. But that stripe will help somebody with impaired vision find the step, not be confused by my carpet here with all those squares and lines on it. It helps them not miss the top step. It helps them not miss the bottom step as they go up and down. If you were with me yesterday, I talked about the stripes, and when you're outside the building, there's a stripe on every single tread and the top landing. Inside the building, they just require one on the bottom and on the top landing. So that's to tell people that they've moved from one place to another, that they're about to have to step up or step down. Again, yesterday we talked about handrails. You notice the curious little D-shaped protrusions on the beginning and end of the handrail. And I'm sure walking around the world, you've seen those a lot in one version or another. And that is intended to help people approaching the stair get attached to the railing, get their hand on the railing, get comfortable before they have to start climbing the stair. And it gives them something to hang on to as they reach the top of the stair and get organized to move away from the staircase. And working down the other way, it's kind of the same thing. You get attached to the railing, start down the stair, get down to the bottom, stabilize yourself and move on. They also help people with limited vision find their way around and find handrails and stairs. So a couple of different uses, and I think you'll find that building officials are increasingly adamant about putting handrails on things. But that doesn't solve the problem of a wheelchair. And here is one of the sort of basic starting places to deal with the wheelchair, and that's the ramp. This works. We can have considerable discussion about how attractive it is, but it does get you from the seating area of the sanctuary up to the pulpit. Okay, with the ramp, in the case of my little church, I'm showing 3 6-inch steps or an 18-inch rise. The rules on a ramp are 1 inch and 12 is the maximum rise you can have on a ramp. And so for an 18-inch rise, the ramp itself, the slope part of the ramp is going to be 18 feet long, at least. You need to have landings at the top and the bottom. The top landing needs to be 5 feet long. At the bottom landing in California, you need 6 feet of flat space to get organized at the bottom of the ramp. Then they need to be handrails on both sides. So this is a solution that works, but it's not a simple solution. And we can discuss the appearance of a ramp. I think it can be done relatively sensitively. We can discuss where it is, where it interferes least with traffic. But there's going to be an appearance problem. This is something in the church that you typically wouldn't see. I think with the flow of worship of people moving about the church, it works fairly okay. It's not brilliant, but it works, you know, it gets the person from the seating area to the pulpit area easily without a lot of fuss, and it is something they can do by themselves without assistance. So that's some of the things you can think about with a ramp. I think once you start thinking about this, we're pretty quickly going to come up with this as a possible solution, and that is the mechanical platform lift. You see them a lot in the world. And what I would think about with a platform lift is, do you really like the way it looks? And there are better looking ones out there and there are worse looking ones out there, but it is still a piece of mechanical equipment that you've introduced to the environment that doesn't necessarily want to be there, I guess. A lift has a maintenance issue. I have been to lots of hotels and buildings where they've put a lift in at one time or another, and if it's used irregularly and not maintained, it frequently doesn't work when you need it. I've seen a lot of them that are rusty and they're filled with litter, and clearly they're just not being used or maintained. Hopefully in your church it would be maintained better than that, but it is a maintenance problem. You have to keep it working. I would also argue in terms of the flow of worship, having somebody important to the worship have to get on the lift, you know, open the gate, get into it, mechanically elevate or lower themselves, open the gate, get off of it. There's clearly an interruption to the flow of things. There may be some noise. It's sort of distracting activity. And you may want to think about how that would affect the worship. And then just because I'm a little bit paranoid, I'm thinking if you have a lift there, there are some people, mostly young people in our congregations, that might tend to think of it as a plaything. Give your girlfriend a ride up and down on it, see how many kids you can get on the lift, I don't know. And while lifts are designed to be safe for wheelchair users, I'm thinking that in a situation where it's being used as a plaything, it might begin to compromise the safety of it and the appropriateness of it. So I struggled a lot with this situation. And this is another solution that I came up with, which is probably in some ways most impactful and least impactful, I suppose. But in a way, it's kind of the smoothest solution. And what I've done here is, this is the same church, has the same elevation change, but starting from about the middle of the sanctuary pews up to the front pew, it's sloping up. The floor is changing its level. And you can see this in this drawing. But if you look at the sills of the big windows along the side, you see that the floor is coming up as it goes forward. If we keep the rise on our floor to less than 1 inch and 20, you don't have to have handrails. You don't have to do anything special about it. It's considered walkable and rollable. There is no maximum length at 1 and 20. So it allows you to sort of move about the congregation pretty easily. And here again, this emphasizes where that slope is. From about the middle of the congregation, it would actually have to flatten out so you can move horizontally at the front, but it takes you into the altar area without having to negotiate a step, without having to deal with a ramp and diverting off of the aisle, without having to use a mechanical device. So here's the way it would look from the congregation. It basically allows you to move about pretty freely. So this type of solution, I would think, is fairly expensive and complicated to maintain, or to achieve rather. It does mean taking out all the pews in the front half of the church, the carpet top, putting a lot of construction in, and then putting everything back. And there are some subtleties to how the slope works with the pews and getting in and out of pews. I think it's very achievable, but it would take some thinking about getting it right. I think the positive for me to this kind of a solution is that everybody in the church uses it the same way. If you're in a wheelchair, if you're in a walker, if you're just walking slowly, or if you're taking up the offering and moving forward with your offering plates, nobody is on a special path. Everybody is walking the same path. And that's really, with accessibility, sort of the gold standard. You're trying to get everybody to as close to the same path as possible. So a sloped floor that makes for no special ramps, no special devices, it's got some things to speak for it. I do see that because the effect of this is to raise up the pews in the front, it may complicate some of the sightline issues because the heads in the front row are going to be a little higher than they currently are. But once it's done, once you've paid the cost of putting it in, there's virtually no maintenance. It's easier to vacuum than the steps that were there before. And there are very few safety issues. There may be some people that might stumble a little bit on a transition in the slopes, but in this case, it's considered a shallow enough transition that there's no legal question with it anyhow. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about mobility as it exists in a congregation. There are things that I didn't talk about, which I think are worth discussing in a larger way of looking at things. One of them would be, how do you provide a disabled pastor with access to the pulpit? We actually did a court building for the County of Los Angeles where we had to think about disabled judges, and we ended up putting platform lifts behind the judges. I don't know what you call it. Judge's pulpit is not the right word, but that's basically what it is. So that he could come in a wheelchair, roll up behind his counter and push a button and rise up into the public view. You know, what kind of access is required to the choir seating? In my little example, I've shown bolted down pews. If we have choir members who are in a wheelchair or in a walker or otherwise move slowly, do we need to accommodate them in some ways? Once we have that, do we have appropriate access to choir robing areas? And how about behind the scenes preparation areas for pastors, getting ready to go on, getting dressed, whatever they need to do? Have we thought about accessibility there? For us brethren who like total immersion baptisms, how do we achieve access to the baptistry? And I shudder to think, but the answer probably is something like the mechanical pool lifts that are available at many hotel and community swimming pools. It can be removable, can be powered, or can be used with a crank or something like that. But we did have one baptism at Glendale where we just rolled the individual in his wheelchair up near to the baptistry, and water was transferred and splashed on him in I'm going to say a sort of Catholic style. Had he been insistent on having a proper Brethren immersion, it would have been a problem. And then I think we just need to look at the spectrum of what kinds of services we have and who participates, whether they're members or guests, leaders and ministers. Just think about how does each one work, and can we get everybody to the places they need to be in the church for these different services? And then, because we're brethren, what does a fully accessible Love's Feast look like? And I think these are all achievable solutions. I'm not going to propose to try to work them out now, but it is something to think about in terms of how do we accommodate people into the church. So again, I'm going to take a quick break. Are there questions here that have come up as we've gone this far? Okay, it's fine. At least let me catch my breath. Okay, so
Jim,
yes.
I am just curious when we're talking about accessibility within, say, the sanctuary area. This is Linda Davis in McFarland, by the way. And you were talking about the ramps or whatever, stairways and so forth. Would building codes require that there be accessibility to the stage area? Or is that more something we would be thinking of in terms of just wanting to accommodate and making our facilities accessible? So it would be an option, but not necessarily a requirement.
The general answer to that is if you're renovating or making a change to the church that involves that area or traversing through that area, the answer is absolutely yes, the building code will require it. The one exception that I did run into in the standard building code, which would probably apply in Nevada, Arizona, allows you to have a 300 square foot raised area as long as it's raised no more than 7 inches. So my 3-step example, no, it's not allowed even in Nevada or Arizona. So a new church, yes, absolutely, you have to solve it. An existing church, if you're doing permitted renovation in that area, you have to solve it. But I think you do get at the real gist of the issue. I would hope for a church, and that is how do we accommodate, our members, our guests, our staff in a graceful and sharing way.
Thank you.
Jim, this is Ross. The part of what made me curious is what you were talking about is if a church who has stairs said, we've got these stairs, we'd like to do that painting thing, or to mark the steps, the top and the bottom,
Yes.
and put up handrails. I mean, is taking little steps like that, does that open you then to having to do everything, or can you do some incremental work in this?
Well, for one thing, certainly if you just did, painting the stripes on it, you don't even probably need to pull a permit on that. I think that incrementally it would be tolerated, and they're not going to, with renovations, they will adjust what you're required to do to the amount of money you intend to spend on your project. So if you're doing a project that costs $50,000, they will take a proportion of that, and that has to be for accessibility improvements. If your entire project is accessibility improvements, I don't think they will force you to then wipe them across the whole building. They will allow you to do that improvement. Essentially the determination is that that the cost you're incurring in this project is 100% accessibility improvements, and they're not going to require you then to add more to it. So I think they would, they'd be very receptive to doing, to handrails, to stripes, to do limited things, to cutting down a few pews to get some wheelchair spaces in, that kind of activity. without requiring, you know, a full-on parking lot to bathroom improvement. Um,
And those would be things that don't require permit, the smaller steps. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that's really an issue. If it's a significant improvement to the building, if it involves electrical, mechanical work, if it's structural work, you really should get a permit. So, and that does get you into that whole ball of wax of then figuring out what you need to spend on accessibility improvements as part of that effort. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, and I'm going to look at somebody not necessarily in a wheelchair. I'm going to look at individuals who have issues with visibility, with vision. So we've all seen these blue signs. And if you were with me yesterday, we saw a discussion of textured warnings. That is, you see them in curb cuts and in front of grocery stores and things like this. Frequently yellow or brown pads with all the little domes on them that make it difficult to roll a shopping cart into the parking lot. Those are there to help somebody with impaired vision not walk into dangerous areas without some warning. We've had some discussion of extended handrails as part of a vision issue and stair stripes. So we're seeing already that we're accommodating some lack of vision. One thing to be aware of is not all people needing visual assistance are blind, and you know, profound blindness is an issue. So in many cases, signage is used, and the signage may be intended for people who are totally blind, and it may be intended for people who just have difficulty orienting themselves in a space. So things about effective signs. You use high contrast. So we use the blue and the white is common. The blue is, it's not absolutely mandatory that it be blue, but it is mandatory that there be contrast, that somebody with cataracts, with compromised vision, can at least find the sign and get some sense of what it is. Signs are virtually always tactile. That is, the figures on the signs, the text, have depth to them. So somebody walking up to the signs, recognizing that it's a sign, but not quite knowing what it means, can touch it, can feel it, and can, if they've got a little practice, they'll know to distinguish between a women's room and a men's room by the touch of the sign. This one does feature pictographs, the wheelchair, the woman in the dress, and text, the word woman. There are specific rules about where those things occur on a sign. So the text and the pictographs shouldn't occupy the same space. Do not confuse people. As I said before, the text is raised so that you can walk up and touch it and feel it. And it has to be a font that doesn't have serifs on it. It's not italic. There's nothing fancy about the font. It has to be legible. And they virtually all have to have Braille text on. And then location is important. If you get into the ADA, you get into the building code, it tells you pretty specifically where these signs have to be. So we have the contrasting triangle and the contrasting circle on the door. So visually, you got a clue that it's there. Not only is it contrasting in color, but if you walk up to the door and put your hand on it, that sign has got depth to it. It's got to be at least a 1/4 inch thick, and it's got to project out from the face of the door. So somebody who finds the sign can touch it, feel it, figure out whether it's a triangle or a circle. And then you've probably seen unisex rooms where it's a circle with a triangle on top of it. So both of those are touchable. And the little blue sign, which is what has the Braille on in this case, has to be, I think it's about 40 inches off the floor, and it needs to be off to the side of the door and not too far, so you can clearly associate that sign with what's in the door. Restrooms are very common, but if you have walked through your church and put a sign that says office or classroom 1 or something on the various doors of your church, technically you need to have a sign there that has at least the embossed word Classroom 1 and the Braille that goes with that description, so that somebody finding their way through the church by touch has a way of knowing what space they're about to enter. Okay, so and then thinking about just having a person in the congregation who's got limited vision. If they are blind, being clear about what's going on at all times is an important issue. They should be receiving, you should understand that they're hearing what you're saying is critically important to them, because that's the experience for them. And especially important in that is instructions about what's about to happen. A couple times I've preached and I have a tendency to forget to say, all rise, or you may be seated. And a person who was blind might find himself standing by himself in the middle of the congregation because he hasn't had a clear instruction. Most of us haven't gotten to it yet, but at some point we may want to think about, if we know we've got a person that's blind, having Braille supporting material. For the partially sighted, there are things to think about. We might want to think about large format Bibles and hymnals. We may print a special printing of the bulletin, which is large format, maybe with less graphics, but easier to read text. And, you know, a favorite of mine is sort of the video and projection displays. And I'm going to digress and talk about those for a few minutes. I think that the video devices we have are really very wonderful for taking people and guiding them through the service, and for helping them understand what's going on. It reinforces what the pastor is saying, and it's just a good mechanism. But we do need to spend some time making sure that what's happening on the video display is legible. Can we read it from the middle of the church? Can you read it from the back of the church? Do we need more than one or two displays at the front? Do we maybe need something halfway back? And I think you need to think about, as you compose these, and we try to do them in artistic colors, do the colors provide sufficient contrast? For somebody with limited vision, for me, I don't have any trouble with this, but if I begin to have cataracts or some other problem that's limiting my vision, these colors may be too close. And certainly we love graphics, but you can overdo the graphics in a hurry. Even a sighted person might have trouble reading the text on a video display that looks like this. And then a good trick, or a good skill to have, and I'm not sure exactly how to get there, think about the colors you're using, because some color combinations are fairly legible unless you're colorblind, and then you might not see them at all. And one of the things about color blindness is that it's mostly us guys that have it, and frequently we don't even know that we've got color blindness. You can go quite a ways through life without realizing that you're not seeing the full range of color. So think about the colors that work together and don't work together. The other thing that obviously you run into, and we've just in the Los Banos project in Plan Check, we ran into a plan checker who pointed out that we need to have an assistive listening system in the church. I presume we were intending to do that anyway, but the plans didn't say that we did. So here again, we're looking at the seating capacity of the church.
We are now.
We are now. And we're looking at how many receivers we have to have. And I think in our capacity, we're probably in the 2 to 4 range. And so it's a good thing to have. And the interesting thing to me is that also we need to think about them for classrooms and for secondary spaces. Although for the word that I got through that Los Banos project is that if you have 50 or more people, it has to be a permanent attached to the building system. For a classroom or something that has less than 50 people, it can actually be a movable system. And what triggers it is if you're using amplified sound, you have to do it. So I'm thinking in a classroom where the teacher is talking, there's no amplification. probably you're not really required to have it. Sanctuary, there's no avoiding it. We need to have some sort of a system. Okay, the systems need to work with hearing aids. This is my mom, while she still lived, was using a hearing aid, and really the amplification in the church didn't do it for her. And there are a lot of headphones you can put on over a hearing aid that also just produce more static than reality. So there are specially designed headphones that work with hearing aids. And the rules are that half of the headphones you have, for whatever amount you're required to have, need to work with hearing aids. So there are special receivers for hearing aids. There are also induction loop systems. I think, Russ, you know about this one. This involves a wire placed around the sanctuary, and the joy of this type of a system, there may be problems associated with it. The joy of it is that modern hearing aids, if you have a modern hearing aid, it's designed to pick up a signal from induction loop systems without any other external device. So something to think about. Sign language, we frequently see that at district conference. You may want to think about having sign language available for people with reduced hearing. And then one that's a personal favorite of mine, in a sense, my daughter went to a school that was intended for people with significant hearing impairments. About 1/10 of the people in the school were there getting special training to deal with hearing. The other 9/10 were people like my daughter with perfectly normal hearing. But part of the issue was that their theory was they didn't teach the kids sign language. They used what hearing aids they needed, but didn't overemphasize that. Their thought was to mainstream the children as much as possible. So these kids learned to understand from the context, from lip reading, whatever, what was going on. And if you by chance have those people in your congregation, they need to clearly see the speaker. So if you're a pastor that likes to walk up and down the aisles and talk a lot, as you do, you're in danger of turning your back on somebody who needs to see your face. So that's, I just put that out there, that there are those people out there. One of the things I was thinking about as I did this is that really very important to a congregation is how we train our greeters, our ushers, if we have them, to recognize people with special needs coming in, to make sure that they find their way to the right seat if there's a seat that needs to be found, to make sure that if there are special materials available for somebody with limited vision, that the person and the material get together, and possibly as they come into the church and they realize we have a guest or somebody who's irregular there who has a special need, that maybe you notify the pastor that Bob is here, and you remember he doesn't hear very well, so that the service can be at least cognizant of the fact that there's a special need there. So I'm coming to the end of my time here. I've got a pause for questions. Before I get there, I'm going to tell you that my email is here. I suspect it's in the church directory as well. JK, and there's an underscore in here that doesn't show because of the way it does links. jklefevre@verizon.net. If you want to get a copy of this presentation, just email me. I will be happy to send it to you. If you have questions related to accessibility, I'll be happy to give you my 10 cents worth of non-official consulting. So if there are any last minute questions, I'm done.
Thanks, Jim. You know, it's been interesting in the district. We have a person who's been a part of the district for a long time who is now serving on the program committee, and really began to voice issues around hearing issues to us. And so, you know, picking up we've started creating some special seating where hearing should be better when we're in person at conference. But the ability to have the closed captioning this year for, we had of 150 people registered, we had 17, I think, who said they have hearing issues. So about a tenth of our people coming to district conference indicated hearing is a problem for them when they're in group settings. And so, I mean, if you start to ask the questions, you begin to hear, I think, from people what some of the concerns are.
One of the things that some of these sessions that I attend to maintain my license you hear from time to time recently is that some people with disabilities have sort of decided that really the story should be that not so much that they have disabilities as that some of us are temporarily enabled. That is, we get old and our vision goes, and we get old and our hearing goes, and maybe we don't walk so well. So while we're feeling good about being able to bound up the steps and hear a pin drop, that may not be the way we finish out our lives. And that some of these accommodations that may seem a little silly today might be much more necessary 10 years from now. So, well, thank you all. And Russ, you going to talk to people about doing evaluations?
Yeah, so if you've been to an insight session already, hopefully you know you will, but about 8:15 today, you'll get an email this evening. You'll get an email with a link to complete the evaluation form, and we hope you'll take time to do
right
that
back.
and give us some feedback on that. Jim specifically would love you to list on there if there's other topics in the areas of accessibility in your buildings. That would be great, as well as other areas you'd like to see the district offering insight sessions in. So are there any other questions for Jim before we let him go for the evening?
I sure appreciated the knowledge that he shared with us tonight.
Very, very helpful. Thank you.
I agree.
Well, I
Thank
want to
you,
thank
Jim.